theology nerds. This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. And today on the podcast, we're having a little book launch party. David Gushee, he is a distinguished professor of ethics at Mercer University, a previous president of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Christian Ethics. And, you know, you may not know this. So we've had a number of episodes at McAfee School of Theology. That is the divinity school connected to Mercer University, where if you go there, you get to hang out with David Gushee as well. Anyway, David Gushee, a very, very good friend of the podcast, and we're having a book launch party for his new book, After Evangelicalism, The Path to a New Christianity. That's right, After Evangelicalism. In the book, he looks at a way forward for disillusioned post-evangelicals, wrestling with all sorts of topics like, you know, the Bible, whether or not you're really an evangelical church life, sexuality, politics, race, biblical interpretation, salvation, things like that. We talk about some of that and more in this live episode that was streamed on the interwebs because we were launching his book, kicking it off the week it came out. So listen and be tempted to go get the book for yourself. Now, before we jump into this, I want to say one thing, one big thing. Thank you to all the people who've gotten my brand new book, Divine Self-Investment. It is open and relational Christology, and I'm super pumped. I mean, I've been getting messages from a whole bunch of you, homebrewed community members, theologians, ministers, and all sorts of people. Like, I'm just super excited. If you haven't checked it out, I'd love for you to do so. But here, I want to read you one response, okay? JC, John Cobb himself, sent me a nice email. And in it, he's like, here's a little endorsement if you want to use it. From JC. All right, John Cobb, greatest living American theologian, John Cobb. He said, systematic theology comes alive in Protestant circles only occasionally. After a significant dry spell, open and relational theology shows signs of renewing it. Once again, systematic theology flourishes, dealing with the history of distinctively Christian thought in a fully scholarly and open-minded way, and taking very seriously the questions generated internally to the Christian tradition. If Tripp Fuller's divine self-investment sets the norm, the quality will be excellent. 3 cheers for the renewal of systematic theology. Oh, yeah. Now, I mean, we all know John Cobb might be the nicest person alive, but either way, he said that, and hopefully that lures you who haven't got the book to go check it out. You can get all the info. Just go to my website, trippfuller.com, where you can get it. And here's another thing that might be exciting. I got some messages. People said, Tripp, is there an audiobook? And I said, no, I've been homeschooling in lockdown. There's never a quiet enough time to record an audiobook version. But I've been recording little bits by little bits at night. So if you are a Homebrewed Christianity community member, then go check your private podcast feed, and you will find Chapter 1 read by me with only minor noises of children in the background. And here's what I've been doing. Not only are you going to get chapter by chapter, the whole book, if you're a member of the Homebrewed community, like you went to homebrewedcommunity.com and joined up, but after I record the chapter, I make a little 5-minute summary of what was going on in the chapter, what I was trying to do, what I think is important, and things. So it's like my own cliff notes to my own book. So, yeah. If you would love to join the community, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. That'd be amazing. You'll be one of the people that support and make this podcast possible. You'll get the audio version of this book and tons of other things, like all these classes we've done with Homebrewed. I don't know, like Walter Brueggemann introducing the Old Testament. Our current Black Theology class has everything in there. I've done lots of fun stuff with some amazing scholars. And you'll get it, you know? So go check it out. homebrewedcommunity.com. Now, here it is. Excitement with David Gushee. Hello, everybody. This is Tripp, and I am here live on the interwebs, or you're experiencing this later, but nonetheless, I'm still with the one and only David Gushee, author of After Evangelicalism. Ethicist, theologian at Mercer. So how are you feeling, David?
I'm good. I am glad very much to talk with you in some setting other than a noisy bar. So I think this will, we'll have a nice, quiet conversation before millions gathered around the world, and I appreciate that.
Well, just because, see, here's the thing is that people don't realize this whenever I record podcasts at breweries. I'm like, don't worry about the people that are here. There's another 50,000 people that will hear this regardless. So just like lean into your high quality material and ignore the drinking people that are just mostly glad that their Baptist Divinity School decided to visit a brewery, which McAfee did. So is it amazing or super amazing that you get to work with Greg, right? Like, I feel like Greg's a high quality, dean to work with.
He's great to work with. He really is. We've stabilized a lot, and he's been nothing but supportive. And yeah, it's been great. Really has.
So when you write a book after evangelicalism, were you anticipating that from the time you finish the book until it comes out, that the apparatus of the grand old party would work just to make your book more and more timely?
Going right to the politics, huh? Yeah. Chapter 9. The book was finished at Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Christmas of last year. The presidential campaign was in full swing on the Democratic side. COVID, we didn't know about yet. And now it came out August 25th, and during the Republican convention. And if anything, the sense of relevance, the sense of apocalypse, is, to me, the book is landing at a perilously relevant and opportune time. And if anything, the warnings about the capitulation to Trump look even more profound or even understated or something compared to what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. And what's amazing, I got like 10 questions that were like high quality, I really want to know questions sent in. And then I got 3 extended emails. And there's 2 of the emails, both of them basically wanted to know, it said something like, I've been a Baptist minister, and David Gushee's been a conversation partner of mine, and his whole story has correlated so much with mine. I would love for him to articulate the way in which he sees, and these are both late 30s, early 40-year-olds, Baptist ministers, that shift from kind of baby boomer Baptist evangelicalism to this space where whether or not you want the label and whether or not the questions you have can fit, whether or not evangelical can contain it. Like, how would you narrate that story for yourself? Because they were resonating with so much of what you said.
That's a great question, Trip. To me, what has been the most unexpected development of the last 6 years for me is kind of where you started with that question, which is, I'm not just a disembodied thinker at this point. Like, I have a story, a narrative that has some unexpected drama to it, and it's a narrative that a lot of people are identifying with. A narrative of disillusionment, alienation from an identity that used to work for people, and that began when I wrote "Changing Our Mind" in 2014 and got booted out of the evangelical community for being, gay inclusive, and then the kind of reflection process since that time. I do think that everything has taken a much more dramatic turn. Well, a much more apocalyptic turn since 2016. How about if we say it this way? A generation ago, evangelicalism at least could be defined by its piety and by its theology. Like a lot of us knew evangelicals they just loved Jesus, and they loved the Bible, and they loved church, and they loved theology, right? and sitting around and talking about theology. I mean, there's folks like that still, but for a number of reasons, circa 2016 and thereafter in the U.S. at least, evangelicalism is about this kind of hardline white reactionary movement around Donald Trump. He, that godless man, has helped to change or unveil or worsen the profile of evangelicalism. And so there's I feel kind of like a guide from another land, like, gather around, children. Let me tell you what it was like in 1978, before the moral majority, let alone before Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And so faith used to be a thing. Faith now feels like it has been reduced to something like hardline political ideology. And that is the last straw for a lot of people.
Yeah, and when you say that, I mean, I feel like my generation in Baptist life is a particular place where your parents and a lot of your mentors, when you go through, like, I went to Campbell, I went to Wake Div and stuff. My internships were at the Piedmont Baptist Association, and I was involved in Baptist campus ministry. There was you're growing up in a place where everyone older than you experienced the conservative takeover in a real personal way.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it was this like violent act, and they were trying to decide how to relate to it and the way everything went down.
Yeah.
And then you also have friends that are much more conservative than you, and you don't take it as personal, and yet you do think those issues matter and stuff. But it really wasn't until Barack Obama was elected that my friendships with my friends that went to Southeastern, as opposed to Wake Div or Garner Webb or McAfee or whatever, like, got intense. And I don't know if any of us changed, except that the fishbowl we were in got more intense. So one of my best friends from undergrad and I were hanging out in Scotland the other day. He was here visiting, and he's an IMB missionary. Right. So we've been friends a long time, and both of us had this like sneaking suspicion that we were betraying things by still being friends. Right.
Wow.
And I don't think that's good. So, like, one of the gifts, and I don't know if you intended this, but one of the gifts of your book of saying After Evangelicalism as a Baptist is to go like, yeah, we could actually all plant our flags in different places, but then we could still be friends. It's like when we all need to plant our flag in the same place, we fight. And I don't know if it was intended to be heard that way, but I sent I sent my buddy a message and was like, this book's great because, like, he's telling his own story. Like, it tells your own story of the evangelicalism and how you've changed. But it also says, like, as a Baptist, like, I can be completely honest about my own experience and what I've come to, and that doesn't relativize or diminish your own view, which I feel like in the generation that fought over everything, that there was more involved in it. I don't know if I've asked the question right, but like, I really like that element of the book.
How about if we say it this way? In the 80s and 90s, if you just want to talk about the Baptist side, Southern Baptists in particular, we were fighting for control of the same community. By the mid-90s, those communities had begun to go their separate ways, or had gone their separate ways, and by now it's a long time ago. Something your parents talk about what the fights were like or whatever, right? But I think that in a sense, that Baptist story is now really more like an American story, or like it's kind of like certainly an American evangelicalism story. Those of us who have really decisively said, nah, we're done with this. We're not trying to compete for the same terrain anymore. I'm not trying to, that move, oh, we're the true evangelicals. That's over for me. The term doesn't mean anything to me anymore. I did have to do one last analysis to make sense of it all. That's part of what's here, but there's almost something a little bit scary too. You might say that the space of common contest, like we're all evangelicals trying to figure out what true evangelicalism is or something. Common space is disappearing. So It's like they're over there on their side and we're over here on our side, and we're ending up having two very different kind of conversations. And maybe that's okay in a religious community, probably is. Nationally, we're also having two very, very different conversations of mutual incomprehensibility to the other. And that's part of what I deal with in the book, is that deep, deep division is very scary. But in any case, yeah, we're not fighting with Southern Baptists over who's got Baptist faith and message right, or we're not fighting over what is a true evangelical. Then there is a massive community, I think, of post-evangelicals who are trying to figure out how to do faith and church and life now, and I'm with them and trying to help them. And I think that's people are responding to that.
In one of the, I mean, because of the podcast, I get digital encounters, which are probably similar to the personal ones you get when you travel speaking or with your divinity students, of people who are trying to give positive content to that after evangelicalism space.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the deepest challenges, I think, is to state where you've come positively and to articulate the way you've been blessed by your past, not just the things you're rejecting. So when you think of where the very place you were born and the way in which you were encountered the gospel for the first time, how would you say you've been blessed by evangelicalism that you're leaving behind? And what does it mean to then articulate your faith again after it?
Yeah. I hope that I, both in my memoir, Still Christian, and in this book, I hope that I succeeded in blessing and celebrating those who were such an important part of my journey earlier, you know?
Well, I imagine their pictures are on the screen for people. Like you have a number of pictures, and then you have the Cappadocians right behind your head. So,
I feel like what I got at the beginning was a clear presentation that Jesus loved me and wanted a personal relationship with me, and a disciplined vision of how a Christian attempts to conduct his or her life. Personal piety, personal salvation. There was almost no social ethic, and there was almost no theology, but there was salvation and piety. And that was a launching point. And they trained me in practices that helped to stabilize my life, my psychology, you might say, my vision of what life was to be about. And at that point, they were not heavily political. I don't know if I did I tell this story, I think, in Still Christian. It is true that in the late 70s, in that first church that I was in, there was somebody who worked for a conservative activist organization that recruited me to cut my hair, dye it dark brown, put on a Soviet uniform, and pour a bucket of red paint over a standing globe. And the movie was called Can Soviet Imperialism Be Stopped? What I remember about that experience was I was recruited by a church member for that, and I got $200 to pay for prom the next weekend. So that was good, right? But anyway, that was the exception. It was not heavily political, and the church had diversity. There were Democrats and Republicans in that church. There were pietists. There were Hal Lindsey left behind people. There was all kind of stuff like that. That diversity was okay. And increasingly that just doesn't happen anymore. But I mean, I feel like a very confused young man was stabilized, given a clear identity and a direction. And I could never say enough gratitude for that. I do think that things got a lot worse after the late 70s with the politicization and the whole left-right culture war stuff.
Well, I mean, my experience with it was, if you're a preacher's kid like myself, you basically only are at churches that will hire your family members, which is its own a filter. And I remember the first time I called my parents after becoming a religion major at Campbell and let them know that there were Baptists who didn't think women should be ministers and that weren't affirming of like ostracized people with HIV/AIDS, like our gay neighbors. I was like, could you believe this? My parents were like, yes, I can.
Yeah.
And I was like, really? Because every church I've ever gone to, this is just normal, you know? And I remember my dad going like, trip, you do realize they all had to hire me. And like, there was this, like, because I went to, I remember, like, the earliest memory of Baptist life was going to the Baptist convention for Here's Hope, Jesus Cares for You year.
Yeah.
And Reverend Freddie Haynes was preaching, and I thought that was the best sermon I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And now his grandson is pretty BA on the prophetic preaching. But like, there is this element, I think, in Baptist life, in the way it relates to evangelicalism, that because of the culture dominance in the South, that you can universalize your own experience of it growing up. And when I was a campus minister in dealing with Baptist student ministry, I regularly would see individuals who were in leadership and stuff all growing up, then encountering Baptist life at the big level, being more culturally conservative and domination style, and it not cohering with their experience. And I think that the shift both in politics and news media and everything to the macro, as opposed to like at the local level, has led to a lot of people's own experience have been really positive at the grassroots level to get dismissed as, like, not optimal or not revelatory or not real, when there's tons of churches who, based on whatever denominations on their sign, like, what actually happens in the lived experience of that church is they help feed people, care for people, and welcome people that are there. And when I was worked for a Baptist association in rural North Carolina, that was true about all sorts of places, that if I'd asked them a theology question, I would have been embarrassed by the answer. Mm-hmm. So, like, when you're thinking of moving after evangelicalism, how do you negotiate that tension where a lot of congregations, what their faithfulness looks like can be more beautiful than what their theology sounds like?
One of the things that I think is an important contribution of the book is parsing out that word evangelical and where it comes from. I did more historical digging than I have ever done to try to make sense of that. That's in chapter 1. And one of my conclusions is that the kind of national evangelical brand labeling always had a certain artificiality about it. It was always a rebranding of fundamentalism. It always had kind of hegemonic intentions. And that to the extent that it was successful in swallowing up localized identities, it actually weakened a lot of those localized identities. It's like the Walmartization of some really sometimes sweet Christian folks in that little local Methodist church or whatever somewhere, and so one of the recommendations I make in that chapter is slough off the evangelical national stuff, slough off the branding, and let 1,000 different, more Jesus-centered, less commodified versions of Christianity kind of flourish, So, and in a lot of places that I've gone, like colleges, you take your Brethren in Christ college, or your historically Quaker college, or you take your historically evangelical Methodist college or evangelical free church or whatever. A lot of them did not benefit from association with the evangelical label. What it actually did was to diminish their particular distinctives that made them lovely. And some kind of nationalized right-wing stuff became the version of Christianity that they all had to answer to, and that was not good for them. So I say, declare independence and be yourself.
Yeah, I think that's. I think that's really helpful. So when you think of someone who was at home in evangelicalism, and one of the things I've always admired about you is publicly struggling with questions that you took, I don't know, to the heart in ways I didn't know that we had to argue about them. I don't know if that makes sense. Like if you asked us about how American Southern evangelicalism and the way white supremacy reigns in it. Like in high school, I got into reading James Cone, right? So like that critique was always there. You model for me something I wish more congregants would do, like where it wasn't on your plate, it came on your plate, you wrestled with it, you try to own it, then you try to reflect it out. The question around inclusion of LGBTQ individuals in the life of the church, like that wasn't a live question the same way. You wrestled with it and came to these positions and such. And as someone who has publicly changed their mind this much, which should be more popular for Christians, by the way, publicly changing your mind as you wrestle with experience, testimonies, and scripture should totally be more popular. But nonetheless, you do it regularly, even though the rest of us pretend we've always thought the same thing. What is it like to write a book where the changing of your mind means you're leaving a label behind that was always essential to who you are?
It is harrowing at times. Now, what was interesting is the first time I did that with the book, Changing Our Mind, I did not know, naively, I did not know that it meant that I was leaving the label behind. What I thought I was doing was contributing to an evangelical conversation. What I learned was, oh no, we're not having that conversation, not in this way. And so there was a certain naivete at that point about the range of the conversation. But I learned from that too. I don't know. It's almost like, maybe a way to say it is, as I have wrestled, I have shown my work. It's like, here's the wrestling. It's like a math problem where you show your work, you show how you got from this to this, from the problem to the solution. I really feel like that's kind of what I've ended up doing over these last few years. And I think that people have resonated with that because it sure is a long way from the typical Southern Baptist Church of 1978 to embracing womanist and liberationist theology, right? I mean, and a lot of people, they can never make that journey. There's too much cultural baggage. They can't make that change. Just to kind of document how that change has evolved for me, I think is helpful for people. But it does involve being willing to say, and in this new book, I make it a matter of assertion, constantly learning and growing through exposure to new input, whether it's, as you said, testimony or theology or history or whatever, is fundamental to the Christian life.
In one of the questions that, and someone just mentioned on Facebook, but I got sent in advance, was when you use the word evangelical, is it white evangelicalism that is what you're really after, in quotes? Because a lot of African American members of the church would, if you ask them theological questions, be evangelical, right. But their hermeneutic is one that comes from kind of the Black church liberation tradition, and those same affirmations, theological affirmations, are interpreted from like a different community, and they just sound different when it gets to ethical questions.
Yeah. I wrestle with this in the book and conclude that the post-1940s use of the term evangelical, pioneered by people like Carl Henry and such, was always laden with whiteness, but it was not acknowledged. It was a bunch of white guys who were trying to reform white fundamentalism. And so the framework, without knowing it explicitly, was white supremacist. It was whiteness. Then, gradually they realized, they wanted to include Black and Latinx churches and stuff, but they wanted to include them and their people within the terms of white evangelicalism. Come to our movement, which we lead. And the differences that constantly emerged over the problems of white supremacism and over the assumed political frame is always going to be kind of reactionary white supremacist. And when that gets challenged, then the idea is, oh, you're not being theologically orthodox. So my claim is that whiteness dominated the birth of modern evangelicalism in ways that were not acknowledged at the time. And this is one reason why the term is so puzzling. Like when I use the term with my students at McAfee, my African-American students, it's just a different frame. It's a cross-cutting frame. It's like, well, theologically, yes, I guess mainly, but politically, no. And what does that mean? Do I even need to worry about this term or whatever, because it's just it's a different universe in some ways. So all of that is dealt with in the book. I think that the critique would be that white evangelicalism as a movement has dominated the American scene and has suppressed the distinctive voices of non-white evangelicals, attempted to stuff them into the frame, and then if they attempt to really lead with an integrity that is related to their life experience and background, then they tend to get sloughed off or pushed out.
Mm-hmm. So when you think of, when you're asked the question, who is God, how does becoming a theologian after evangelicalism change the way you answer that question? Right? Because if you are within a particular tradition, right, like there's this hermeneutical kind of like space where you can interpret particular confessions in one way or another and like try to like expand them or whatever. Say like the open theists within evangelicalism
right.
Have a particular theological question around God changing and God's relationship to suffering, but the whole framework for them wrestling with that idea is a thoroughly evangelical context. And so they're so faithful in certain areas, they compress it in others. When you move beyond evangelicalism, like what are the theological questions and spaces that all of a sudden there's new energy or excitement for you to think through?
Tripp, unlike you, I am not a trained theologian, and so
well, you might be one of the most listened to theologians. So
okay, well, thank you. So I'll just tell you kind of what I did in the book. What I did was, I would say, some biblical theology, in which I re-entered the story of the Hebrew Bible and the story of the New Testament to ask, what do I take this story or these stories to mean now that I am no longer attempting to conform to some kind of evangelical orthodoxy that for the first 14 years of my career, actually probably the first 20 years of my career, had the power to harm me if I violated it. In other words, I'm able to think some free thoughts. And so in the chapter on God in the Old Testament and the chapter on Jesus, I re-entered both the biblical narratives, asking kind of who is God here? What does it mean to be part of the people of God? Who is Jesus? What was his mission? What does it mean to take up a part of that mission? And to listen to voices that a lot of times evangelicals don't listen to. I claimed some of my own older theological sources that I realized these are still most formative for me, like Holocaust theology is important in the book. And a close study of the historical Jesus remains important to me, and what the biblical scholars do. The Jewish theological traditions, especially post-Holocaust, like people like Elie Wiesel and Martin Buber, and so on. Still, social gospel still resonates with me, and I went back there. Catholic theology resonates in some ways with me, and I went there. So I would say an entire reboot, naming my theological sources, revisiting the text, and attempting to at least sketch some working theology that sustains me. And we'll see whether that is seen as successful. But I felt like I needed to do that, and I hopefully there's some quality there. Yeah.
Well, no, I really liked it. Like, I mean, I generally like your books, but this was my new favorite.
Tripp, awesome, man.
So
Okay, that's going to go on our Facebook page.
This is generally my new favorite. High quality endorsement. I will. But there are three things. Here are the three things. Like, if you were like, Tripp, could you write a review of this book for like some Baptist journal and say things so that the person that writes the review doesn't have some like weird hang up because he still wishes he was at Southern? Then this is what I would say: is that one, like, After Evangelicalism is an assistance that to be a true evangelical is to be more biblical than evangelical. Right. Okay. And so, like, in multiple places in the book, you talk about how, like, the actual testimony of the people of Israel is that God is like X. And if the tradition says God's like not X, you're going to go with X. Right. The That's other good, one man. Was that moving after evangelicalism means that the question of power cannot be like localized. Because when the question of power gets localized under evangelicalism, it's there to be the cover-up of the domination system's localized power, right? So, and you pointed out in the book around the relation of race, the relation of economic justice and stuff. You hint at it related to ecological issues. Mm-hmm. But after evangelicalism, if you look at the way evangelicalism's role it's played in American Christianity, is as the justification system for kind of white supremacy in its ignorance of, like, it preserves the ignorance of the domination system, right? And so, like, you're resisting that. And the third thing that stuck out to me in it is after evangelicalism is an insistence that salvation is about all of creation and not individuals. And that shows up in multiple places. Okay. But for those of us that grew up evangelical, salvation always had this very limited horizon of the self. And in it, you're going like, yeah, but if you're a self, you're in community, you're in a family, you're in a faith community, you're in like all the way out to like the whole ecosystem that you're in. And so salvation has to be more than that. And like, in one sense, I get why you would title it After Evangelicalism, but in another way, you could say it just called like wholeheartedly gospel-centered, right? And that's not a negative statement, right? Like, I did grow up in a place where there were these limits, where questions of race and class or our relation to non-living humans were live, or like where salvation had something to do with like non-human subjects, and like there are so many ways. But my experience of reading it is and I have friends that grew up in evangelicalism that wouldn't have like articulated it this way, but my reference to them, go read this book, is that it explains the way you were blessed in evangelicalism to invited into this experience of the living and life-giving God. Mm-hmm. And then it was precisely that God that threw you out of it. Mm-hmm. Because
that is exactly right, Tripp.
Salvation isn't that small. The object of God's desire isn't that little. And the horizon of salvation isn't that reduced. I feel like the title doesn't communicate the positive affirmation at the heart of the book.
The superstar young church historian Kristen Dumas of Calvin, who has her book Jesus and John Wayne, it's everywhere. Her endorsement basically said that. I mean, she basically said this book is about the transition out of evangelicalism, but there's a transcendent thing that's going on with this book that transcends its original purpose. So this is almost like through the birth canal, out on the other side, and it's really what's out on the other side. And the name of the book may suggest it's more about the transition to the other side as opposed to what's on the other side. But if somehow there's enough of a vision there that people feel like, wow, this is a substantive theological vision that I can hang my hat on, you can leave evangelicalism behind at peace because it's over and that's okay, and I'm moving on, then I will feel like the book really succeeded, Mm-hmm. What did you think of the Christian humanism language? Did that work for you?
So here's Tripp's internal monologue on things, is that I think stuff, then I write it down, and then I ask a couple friends that have read it, because I realize most people don't, one, have a podcast that involves them reading 400 or 500 pages of the people they're interviewing regularly. Like, so I know that as most scholars do not actually read as much as me, because their like side gig is reading the people they're interviewing, right? And so like, I asked a couple of my friends that are humanists about the way you reframe it. And I think, apart from, I wish there was a label we could use to include all living things, the way like Christian humanism functions, I think needs to be one where where to say Christian humanist means I'm showing up on behalf of the dignity of all humans.
Yeah.
And as someone who, especially because of the podcast, like I got an email just even today from a Baptist minister in the South who said, I wrote this op-ed, sent it to my deacons. And the op-ed's basically like, my family used to own slaves. And in front of our courthouse is a statue of a slave owner. And I want to write an op-ed that says, I want it to be gone. But I'm not going to put this in the op-ed because I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, even though I'm the senior minister at the First Baptist Church.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say that as a person, I'm uncomfortable with this. But I'll find out if I'm allowed to say this is wrong. Right. And he's a minister at a CBF church. And,
Wow.
The back and forth, and this is, I've had like multiple emails like this from people in different places. Like he's in Virginia, but the same's true from people I know in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and the like, where the breaking point we're at is one where even if you might be on the other side of the fundamentalist divide, you aren't on the other. Like that doesn't break evenly on the cultural divide, I think, that's going on in the macro.
Yes, that's totally right.
And like, I don't even know what good advice is to that, because I moved to California and worked at a liberal UCC church for 10 years while I did my PhD and then was teaching full time and stuff. And then I moved to Scotland. So like, I almost don't want them to take what Tripp thinks is a good idea seriously, just because, like, I'm not dialing it back because I get rewarded for my hyperbole, not like solidarity for my like particular, like the way I nuance things particularly. But I do think there's something that's come up that's not just like evangelicalism's kind of personalistic gospel, or even just acknowledging our history as white Christians, but that there's something that Christianity longs for related to culture dominance that is violently resisting letting go of. And I don't know what that is. And as someone who is a minister where being Christian was definitely not culture dominant in Los Angeles, I found being a minister there wonderful and enthralling. I baptized lots of people in the ocean, confessing Jesus Christ as Lord in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and found to be a great place to be a progressive Baptist. But none of it had to do with that culture dominance clinging. Like, what do you think about that? Because I feel like they need to be separated.
Oh, there's no question about it. I think that one could hardly do better than at least starting with the idea that we're talking here about white Christian supremacism. In some cases, white male Christian supremacism. We are in charge of this country, period. And where you find that most clearly prevalent still is in the South. And and the over-identification of the history of America with God's will, and therefore the difficulty of dealing with the sins of the past. And by the way, the story you told me about that minister, that's ineffably sad that he would feel like he needed to run by his deacons the humble little idea that maybe we should take down that statue. It's really sad. It also, I totally agree that if you do a little inside Southern Baptist baseball, the SBC CBF split did not deal with the race issue. And the CBF is still, in many of its outposts,
True story,
still struggling to deal with the race issue. And repentance is difficult. I think sometimes repentance is difficult, especially for a group that feels like aggrieved and righteous from its birth, right? You know?
Well, like if you were the object of scorn in a sense in the takeover, right? You're the victim. It's very easy then to choose to acknowledge the way you are the violator and
very difficult.
Yeah.
So what I think has happened is that the last gasp of a white male Christian dominated society is articulated as a howl by Donald J. Trump. And to the extent that Christians find that attractive, find that speaking for them, then in a sense, Christians are revealing themselves to be more about white cultural dominance than they are about anything like the gospel. And that is, I think, that is, again, one of the main forces, this deep, deep revulsion on the part of like young people, dissidents say, hey, this is not right. This is skin crawling. This is not right. This is not who you raised me to be. This is not who you said we're supposed to be. And you're being this way. And you're supporting this. I must flee. But the pastoral passion of the book is, with the maze, right? The pastoral passion of the book is, don't feel like you have to lose Jesus in fleeing. I love what you said. Maybe those same people invited you to meet Jesus, but then you realize that to follow Jesus, you have to leave that community. Mm-hmm. If a community becomes so toxic, an antichrist community, to meet Jesus or to follow him, you're going to have to leave.
And I feel like this moment is a hard one because in the popular context, there's one way, especially via social media, the discussion happens. And then there's what happens at the congregational level. Like even just this week after the RNC, like when Eric Metaxas sucker punches some guy and then is like scooting backwards with his like, I don't know, like Super Larry from VeggieTales style, like back scoot. And then Rob Dreyer's like, well, I feel like, you know, these people earned it. And you're like, clearly you've opted in for the Benedict option. And
that's a big deal. To me, that story, you know, is a pretty big deal, you know, really embarrassing. Yeah, you're right.
But it's like the thing that strikes me about it was my three friends from undergrad, like, and we're like good friends enough that if we're ever together, we hang out. Posted Rob's like I'm taking sucker punching a protester after going without a mask at the president's, you know, soiree, pass, you know, like affronting the Constitution. like their responses were, this is the world we're living in, where some 22-year-old anarchist is protesting this, and we need the 58-year-old who like created VeggieTales to sucker punch him. And also, clearly, this is his Bonhoeffer moment, you know?
Clearly, yeah.
And you're just like sitting there going like, I remember us reading Paul Tillich together and thinking you were smart. And I remember early in your ministry where we had discussed like challenges you had. Like one of them got a lot of flack for doing an interracial marriage, and yet he's here like posting like anyway. Like I just feel like there's something going on that for people who there's something going on in evangelicalism that if you're not in it, you don't understand what they're drinking, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, the book, I believe a couple places describes it as a moral collapse. I think it's a moral collapse.
In the black hole imagery, I what was it, maybe it wasn't you. I read like 3 books recently on this, and one of you that wrote about it used the black hole imagery, like where, like it's not just evangelical collapse; it's where the collapse itself eats itself, right? And so the energy like collapses in and on itself, and so if you ask a question about how a black hole works, like you realize your math isn't Euclidean, right? Like, and so like if you want a rational explanation of how evangelicalism supports white supremacy, and then you're looking at a working class white person who is friends with people and they aren't racist, you're like, how does this work? And then you're just like asking how the math of a
yeah. And my original dissertation, my work was on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and so not every I don't rush to make comparisons. I will make this point: people can be morally seduced from a fairly questionable base, but still tolerable, to a place of real dangerous extremism. They can be morally seduced by a politician within a small number of years. In studies of what it was like in 1933 in Germany, like Jewish people would say, yeah, in December of 1932, these people were my friends. And by April of 1933, they refused to acknowledge that I existed. And then by September of 35, they were happy for me to be stripped of my citizenship and so on, right? So I think we're talking about a seduction, but a seduction based on an already seducible community. And in a sense, the book is partly about that in the area of race and in the area of politics. But I also try to diagnose what was wrong with the theology that helps to contribute to the seducibility. And I think there are some insights there,
Well, what do you think is the starting point for people that are evangelical but overcoming for their theological conversation? Like where do you think the kind of initial starting points could be?
You mean for us to leave it behind?
Yeah, like if you recognize the way evangelicalism may have blessed your own spiritual journey, and yet there are these issues where you go, this requires me to grow and stuff. Like what are the starting points or theological transitions that you think are most essential or revealing for moving past that?
Well, I would say, my best answer is to point to what I tried to do in the book. One is to recover the deep social justice and human dignity strand of the Bible, and to revisit the Hebrew Bible and see that instead of, a lot of the stuff that we either ignoring what's in the Hebrew Bible or making it all about divine determinism of everything that happens, right? So all of that. Recovering a Jesus who is not blessing Americanism or just about my personal salvation. Did you like my Hallmark Christmas movie Jesus? The sentimental Jesus.
It all depends on who plays Hallmark Christmas Jesus. Like it needs to be. What's the guy that played Hercules and then played the God's Not Dead guy? That guy,
right? Okay. So anyway,
if you want to know what's some fun, I have a drinking game built for God's Not Dead movies.
Oh boy, we should do that sometime. Okay,
no, you don't want to say that on public on a live stream. But
okay,
next time I'm in Atlanta,
All right. Okay. There we go. So I think I do think it's well, I think that in general, white Christianity deformed itself in order not to deal with justice and human suffering, not to deal with the oppression that we were wreaking on our neighbors. And so one of the best places to reconstruct is to read some Black liberation theology, is to read womanist theology and ethics, it's to read feminist theology. In other words, it's to listen to the voices of those who we were shoving to the margins and we were harming. For me, when I started listening to LGBTQ Christians talk about what it was like, to be raised in evangelicalism, that was a clue. And that kind of helped to tumble into place that the liberation theology that I could barely cope with at Union Seminary in New York actually had far more relevant insight than anything that was happening anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say. Go to the margins of people who have looked up at the boot of white evangelicalism stepping on its face and ask, what do you have to say? So I think it's time. I mean, a lot of times in evangelicalism, we were taught all the people we were not supposed to read. Oh, by the way, Tripp, I have learned that already in some places people are warning people about this new book. You definitely don't want to read this new book by David Gushee called After Evangelicalism. Very dangerous.
Well, you know what?
So go to those books.
What I say is, like, if David Gushee's edgy, then we're in trouble, So
that's it.
I know you're about to show up at an ordination service, so
yes.
This is my last question.
All right, my friend.
I have, at least 4 more, but I'll save the other 3.
I want round 2 whenever you want, man, but I do have to do this ordination. Yeah,
I support ordaining people.
There you go.
So after evangelicalism, what is the main line that shows up in your prayers, right? Like when the torture, and this is one of the questions I got, was like, the pain of deciding to leave evangelicalism behind was so intense. What does a prayer sound like when that weight, that inertia, that tradition isn't there? Like, what are the first words in prayer after evangelicalism?
Wow, Tripp.
Sally is the one that asked this question. I read it and thought, high quality question. I'll ask it.
How about this? My prayer as the writer is that people who were consumed with disillusionment and bitterness because of something, whether it was sex abuse scandals or sexism or purity culture, we haven't even talked about that, or racism or Trumpism, and said, well, forget it. I am church. I am done with church people. That they might rediscover Jesus again as a friend. And that the way of life that he lived and taught, which in general has almost nothing to do with a lot of white evangelicalism. In fact, as you said earlier, it's kind of, there's that, and then there's actual Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. That they would give Jesus another look, and that he would be a consoler to them, and that they could come out on the other side of this maze and find Jesus. I've moved from to a place where I feel like for a lot of people, it's only after evangelicalism for them that they'll be able to re-encounter Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that's been true for me too. But it is hard to look back at the community that you identified with and served and were a part of and were deeply embedded in its culture and say, there's a lot that is not of Jesus there. That's really hard.
You know what's fascinating to me about your statement of that is, just in the past couple weeks, which in lockdown in Scotland, we still listen to scientists, so it's a more aggressive. Diana Butler Bass and I talked the other day, and the whole beginning of her next book was that I regret the way kind of more progressive Christianity has eliminated Jesus as my friend language. Yeah. Right? And John Cobb sent me his last book. I mean, I don't know what a 96-year-old telling you this is your last book, whatever, who writes a couple every year. But right. the book is on salvation, and the whole first chapter is like, I began my whole trajectory as a theologian as someone who thought ultimate reality is like a loving parent, and now I'm at the end. I just want to tell everyone I still think that's true. So he writes this book on new book on salvation in light of the ecological crisis, like where God is ultimately loving parent, and that's why I think like moving after evangelicalism has to be about God.
Yeah.
Like if it's about politics, there's so many ways you can be political.
Yeah.
If it's about like who you hang out with or culture, there's so many ways you can be lots of places. But if it's after evangelicalism and it's theological, then it's about the very nature of ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And if the most true thing about you, and this is, I feel like it's basic Protestantism, is that you are the beloved of God. That the most true thing about you is you're known and loved completely by God. And you can't shake that identity. And that if any system, even religious ones, political ones, cultural ones, all that kind of stuff, says you're less than that, they're lying, because the God of all creation says you are my beloved. Then it is great to be after that. There's no more gospel-centered activity than to leave an ideological regime behind where you, your neighbor, or your enemy aren't the object of belovedness from the divine, divine of all things, right? And yet, like so many people have been blessed and cursed from evangelicalism in ways there aren't easy pathways to affirming that. And one of the things that struck me so much in your book, just based on who I decided to text to say it existed, is it articulates life-giving pathways where you've been blessed as someone born into, you don't pick where you're born in the world. You're thrown in the world. Who knows who your parents are, what time period, what culture you're placed in, all that kind of stuff. And yet they're born in a context of evangelicalism, and yet they felt affirmed and trust this deep sense of them, of reality. You can receive that and not absolutize your context. And your book gives such a great affirmation of that reality and permission to affirm something bigger, that I'm just like thrilled it exists. I still like that you exist, but nonetheless, this book is great, I think, at capturing that. So I just want everyone to check it out. And when they do, they can send more questions. The next time you're on the podcast, I'll ask them.
Trip, that's great. That is so meaningful to me. I really did not want to be about just another critique. It's easy to critique, or just another attack. And I do believe that the problem sometimes on the mainline side is an unwillingness to articulate clearly either a piety or a theology. There's a social ethic, but a lot of times not much piety or theology. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to offer like a legit, like you said, how you said it, life-giving theological pathways. We can actually believe things, not just know what we don't believe anymore. And that's what I hope the book offers. So thank you. And I'd love another conversation. There are a lot of details we haven't talked about. Whenever you'd like, let me know.
Well, at an hour at a time, it can happen.
Hour at a time.
And I hope that whoever it is you're showing up for the ordination knows that you're blessing them on behalf of not just the people from the tradition you came from, but the people that haven't found the tradition they're going to belong to. And that is, I think, the ministerial challenge everyone after evangelicalism is wrestling with.
Thank you so much, my friend.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hanging out on the internet.
Till next time.
All right. I will talk to you later. Peace.